I know there's a lot going on right now, but I'm going to take some time to talk about the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which will be tomorrow. I'm recording this on September 10th, 2021. 20 years. And there's been a lot that's happened since then that has been important and huge, but for a one-day event, I think that it stands out as unique. And it was an inflection point in policy, in culture, in law, in history, and it was also the inflection point in millions of lives, maybe even more than that. And of course, the people who died, obviously, an inflection point where they ended their lives and wounded or lost someone, but then millions and millions of other people around the world and in the United States. But I wasn't sure. There's so much you can go. There's so many angles that you can look at the topic that it's huge. Like if someone was to do, certainly not me, a series on 9/11, it could just be hundreds of hours long and just scratch the surface. So I wasn't sure exactly what to do until last night after I got home late at work. I saw that Sam Harris had uploaded another podcast. And I've respected and listened to Sam for years now. Not quite a decade, but close. And I don't agree with him on everything. There's lots of shortcomings in his analysis. He definitely has ideological blind spots. But I do respect him. He can be very lucid, very articulate, and he can be intellectually honest and courageous even in the right circumstances. And one thing that I did not appreciate, and he had mentioned this in a podcast a few days ago, that 9/11 really changed his life. Now, he didn't know anyone who died. He was on the West Coast when it happened. But he started writing his first book on September 12th, right? He's written many, many books. This seems to be the event that got him from, I have opinions about this that matter, that I hold dearly, to I need to express those opinions and share them with the world. And you know what? I think on net, it's wonderful in that case. But there are things that show that he still has some of his blind spots, and it's kind of terrifying. So I'll put a link to the whole video. It's only half an hour long. Most of his podcasts are much longer than that. But I just want to play one part. And in this part, he's talking about, and I'll say, Sam has been good. I mean, he's definitely a liberal person. He would agree with that. Obviously, he has his own intellectual pedigree, and it's unique to him, and it's he's thought his positions out. So he's not adopting things willy-nilly like the vast majority of people do. He's put some thought into this, but he also has put himself in some echo chambers, right? When you look at the people that he has on, they by and large are people that he read about and liked their stuff, and so he had them on, and they just confirmed to a large extent what he knows. But he's talking about here the idea, this is what really struck him, that 9/11 happened because of religious fundamentalism, the belief in paradise. These people are willing to kill themselves because they believe that when they die, they'll go to paradise. And much of what he says, I think, is completely correct. I think that this moral relativism, this cultural relativism, this belief that you can't criticize other cultures or that religion can't affect people or the way they think, I think that's completely wrong. Religion can affect how people think in all kinds of different levels. And at some level, it can be because people actually believe the theology, and they'll actually do things because they have a sincere belief in a supernatural reward or punishment or some combination. And that's without question an element in 9/11. The fact that these guys are by and large Muslims, some of them more so than others, definitely colored their behavior. And to some of them more and to some of them less. But then, and in the politically correct climate existed then and has become even worse since then, he he's courageous for being willing to do that. He's courageous for being willing to critique, in some case castigate, what is officially a marginalized group. It's kind of ridiculous given that there's like 1.5 billion Muslims and they rule, 50 countries or whatever it is. But in the West, it's seen that way. But then he says this.
Some political scientist will emphasize the territorial claims of certain jihadists, or their sense of humiliation, say. But when we look at the claims themselves, when we hear what these people say, both in their public and private conversations, in many cases we know what they say in private. It always comes down to one thing above everything else: paradise. Yes, Osama bin Laden objected to the presence of foreign troops on the Arabian Peninsula. That's what motivated him. So that sounds like a quasi-rational political grievance, right? But American troops were there at the request of the Saudi government. We had saved them from a likely invasion by Saddam Hussein. They wanted us there.
Really? Like, because the Saudi government did something, everyone in Saudi Arabia must be thrilled and happy. If the government does something, then the people of that state must all be happy and thrilled. What the actual fuck? Now, one of the things that Osama bin Laden said in his fatwa against the United States, and he only lists one there. He lists the support of the state of Israel, and he specifies massacres, especially the first Qana massacre that the state of Israel perpetrated against, in that case, Lebanese civilians. Okay? And that's a very secular argument. And what would Sam say to that? Well, the Saudi government gets along with the Israeli state, so this isn't a real objection. No, it is. He also said that the United States supports these Muslim dictatorships, and specifically Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, the 35-year president at that point, or no, it would have been about a 20-year presidency at that point, and the House of Saud, the ruling royal family of Saudi Arabia. So it's clear that Osama bin Laden does not like the Muslim government, the government of Saudi Arabia. He hates them. And many people hate them. Many of their own people hate them. You can well imagine this, Sam, that many people in America hate the American government, whether they're liberals who hate Trump or conservatives who hate Biden or anarchists who hate everybody equally. Those people are real, and they're numbered in the millions in any of these states. Okay? So does he not know about that fatwa? Does he not know that he lists that out? And the other thing too, how would I mean this mischaracterization of the first Gulf War? First of all, we had bases there before the first Gulf War, but they were invited in. They also said that they were scared. They were only worried. Their only concern, and they had this interview with Dick Cheney, who was then the Secretary of Defense. They were like, our only concern is that once Saddam Hussein is neutralized, and there is a lively and honest debate to be had whether or not Saddam Hussein was ever going to invade Saudi Arabia. He never said that he was going to. He never alluded to that. His strife with Kuwait goes way back. Okay, there were disputes with Kuwait, and I'm not saying that what they did was okay or right, but there were disputes with Kuwait going back decades, border disputes from whenever they had lost their colonial status from the British left and established the Hashemite kingdom, two Hashemite kingdoms, one in Jordan, one in Iraq, and then in Kuwait. And the U.S. government was giving very mixed signals, to say the least, to Saddam Hussein. The ambassador told him that it was none of our business and they could do what they thought was best. It seems like they didn't anticipate that they would occupy the entire country, but maybe just the northern oil fields. And of course, they had been subsidizing Saddam Hussein as someone on the front lines against the Iranian Revolution, which he'd been doing for us and also for the Gulf states, places like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, all these places that hate the Shiite revolution in Iran and who are intimidated by what by all rights should be and probably at some point will eventually reassert itself as a regional hegemon. And Saddam thought, I'm doing all the fighting, I'm doing all the dirty work, and all I want is for the price of oil to be a little bit higher, $23 or $25 instead of 21. And the Saudis said, well, we want to put it at 19. So there's really no evidence that he wanted to invade Saudi Arabia. Maybe he could have, and the Saudis found themselves in this very awkward, and there's a good book on this if you want to read it, Unholy Babylon, which is written before the U.S. war, but after the invasion. The Saudis suddenly realize that everybody hates their guts because they're rich, and they don't do anything, and they're arrogant pricks. And they kind of like, wait, no one's going to defend us if we need to. And it's not clear that they would have. But when Prince Turkai or Prince Fahd or whoever it was who met with Dick Cheney, they expressed concern that after Saddam Hussein was annihilated, that the Americans wouldn't leave. And they said, well, of course we'll leave after Saddam Hussein is defeated. Of course we'll do that. Because there will be no reason for us to stay. We don't want to stay here. But then, in what many people then and now fail to understand, after completely obliterating Saddam's military, just bitch slapping their Soviet junk back into the Cold War, with all the technical, mechanical horror that American capitalism in the early 1990s could create, and then explicitly encouraging the minorities, the Kurds and the Shiites, which the Shiites are not a minority, they're a majority, but they're oppressed by a Sunni minority. After George Bush told them to revolt, with Saddam on the rocks, with his military destroyed, his dictatorship discredited, after bringing this calamity on his country, they fucking stepped back and let him stay in power. In fact, they even let him deploy what remained of his military to crush and kill hundreds of thousands of Shiites and Kurds. I remember watching it on the news as the refugees tried to make their way into Turkey or Syria or Iran. There's even movies about it. If you ever see the film Three Kings, it's about this period. And the mendaciousness of Bush Sr., George Herbert Walker, to encourage them to revolt and say that we will support you and then not. And and we don't know why, right? The cynic in me believed and still thinks it's very plausible. They left him there as an excuse. Well, now we can't leave Saudi Arabia. We need to stay. We can't leave now because we didn't get rid of him. Even though, well, you could have gotten rid of him. Obviously, they could have. Now, that's the cynical read, and I think that's a very plausible option. It's also possible that they realized what would likely happen, and what would likely happen is what happened 12 years later, which is Iraq becomes Shiite dominated and becomes an ally of Iran, because that was obviously what was going to happen when you topple over the Sunni dictator Saddam Hussein. For whatever things you want to say about him, he's not a puppet of Iran and never was going to be. And they never had a more intractable foe than him. So there is evidence that the Bush administration, the first one, realized, oh, well, if we topple him, the next thing you know is Tehran is going to rule Baghdad. And, well, we don't want that because I guess we hate Iran more than we hate Iraq. It's hard to pick sometimes, right? And so I don't know which one it was, okay? But I also don't think it really matters from the point of view of somebody in Saudi Arabia. And just step back and imagine. Try and build, look, different countries, different times, different cultures, for sure. So analogies are going to not be perfect. But step back and think about this. Imagine how much Sam Harris, right? Sam Harris is one of the classic people with Trump derangement syndrome. And let's say that everything that Sam Harris thought about Donald Trump is not only just a rumor or a theory, but is absolutely true, 100% true, that he was a puppet of the Russians, that the Russians were supporting him. And not only that, that he's president for life, and that his father before him was president for life, and his father before him. In fact, let's do the counterfactual history and say, going back to World War I, that Russian influence led to the overthrow of the Wilson administration. You know, let's say Wilson had his stroke, and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin sent a revolutionary cadre to assassinate other Democrats and to elevate their red millionaire Prescott Trump, the first, to the presidency, and that this puppet Trump ancestor became the lifetime president of the United States, and his children after him formed a dynasty of oppression that would be backed up by by communist Russian military might. They'd set up bases all over the country. You think that started only when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait? Nope. They had bases there for decades before, right? It wasn't. They called it, we're building them for the Saudis, and then we're having people transition in and out, but they had bases there. And just imagine how Americans would feel, how Sam Harris would feel if, every time the Trump dynasty got in trouble, the Russian communist military bases all over the country in strategic locations would step in to make sure they stayed in power and would be launching attacks against their enemies. Maybe there were people in Canada or Mexico, dissident groups that were trying to overthrow the Trump regime. And these Russian were launching drone strikes and airstrikes and cruise missile attacks and killing people by the thousands, by the tens of thousands in Mexico and Canada and in the United States. And then people in Texas just started attacking these bases. What would Sam Harris just say? Well, they're just a bunch of Christian fundamentalists. That's much closer to the scenario that you have in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt and many of these other, Jordan, these other countries. These dictators are sometimes more, sometimes less popular, but all of them are seen as puppets, and correctly so. At the very least, satellites. And if Sam Harris was to just look at the House of Saud in a vacuum, all things being equal, he would find them the most abysmal, reactionary, religious, fundamentalist tyrants that he could imagine. So much worse than the Taliban in every way. Right? But because they're ostensibly part of the American empire, he, is blind or doesn't care, doesn't know I've seen him. He did a long time ago. He talked to the hardcore history people and just completely dropped the ball. Like, just could not get it through his head. Well, get it through your head. Okay, they're bad. Maybe there are worse things out there, but they're puppets. And there's people inside. Like, it's this, I don't know, this is like the Star Trek understanding of like polities where you have a whole planet and there's like three guys who meet the captain and they can somehow speak and identify for everybody in their planet. And granted, these are aliens, so maybe that makes sense with aliens. But with humans, that's bullshit, right? Because somebody is in power. Even when someone's elected, that doesn't prove that everybody who exists in that state has an identical opinion and will just, like a lemming, obey completely, even when they're elected. Okay? Because you don't know why. First of all, in most cases, they don't get most of the people voting for them. They maybe get most of the people who do vote, but not anyone who doesn't vote. And when people vote, you don't know why they're voting. You know, when somebody votes for Biden, you know, Sam Harris voted for Biden. That doesn't mean that Sam Harris supports what Biden did with the Afghanistan withdrawal. And in fact, we know that he doesn't because he said so. And so it would be asinine for someone to say, well, Sam, you must agree with what Biden did because he is the president. No, you don't. And the thing is, as ridiculous and stupid and nonsensical the idea of elections are, the House of Saud don't have elections. They never have and they never will. Right? The day that that happens, they won't be in power anymore, to the extent that the elections decide anything, which by and large they don't. So where does he get off just assuming that, well, because the government invited us in, you know, therefore there's no problem. It's fine. You know, again, if Trump invited the Kremlin in, right? Forget the elaborate mirroring of history. Just to say Trump just invited, you know, Putin's a great guy. He's awesome. And I think it would just be swell if we had him invite a couple military. He can put a couple armored divisions, you know, in Kansas. That'd be fine. Or you know, I'm having trouble in California. So let me have Putin deploy some troops. I'm worried American troops wouldn't be willing to gun down a Californian liberals, so, or in Portland or Washington. So I'm going to have Putin deploy his Spetsnaz there, or China, right? Sam Harris, would you find that totally okay and not be upset, and then be have incredulity when other Americans, you know, expressed anger at something like that? Yeah. So he listed a couple things that he was angry about. Now, does his religion color that? Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. But, you know, Mecca and Medina, okay, yeah, but it's his fucking country. Just like it's our country. How would you feel? You're an atheist. Would you be happy? Would you be happy if Russia or China was putting bases in the United States? You wouldn't even have a religious reason, but you'd still hate it. Right? You would still be furious, absolutely enraged, and you would be one of the most level-headed, least enraged people. And yet you would still probably be willing to go to war to stop it without any religious backing whatsoever. And, you know, there isn't any specific thing in Islam where you can't support a Muslim dictatorship or you can't support Israel. Israel wasn't a state. There's nothing in there about Israel at all. They're just mad that Israel treats people horribly, typically Muslims. They do target Muslims, and we support them 100%. And so, yeah, it's totally fair for them to blame us when it's our military surplus and our subsidy that is helping them commit all of their crimes. And maybe you want to say, well, they're not crimes, and you think it's fine. Okay, suddenly now we're getting into debate, and the debate isn't about what the Quran says. Okay, it's about the secular acts of a state of Israel, or these other dictatorships. Hosni Mubarak, he's not in power now, but he was then, and he had been for 20 years. So I think this is astounding to me. It's astounding to me because he's a smart guy. So who is he talking to? Who is he not talking to? You know, why is he bringing in Peter Gergen and not Scott Horton, right? Like, it's infuriating. it's infuriating. Yes, there are cultural differences. Yes, Islam is important. Yes, the jihad is real. Yes, it will color their response. But to think that that's it, that that's the only reason, and that, well, because their corrupt, evil, despotic, royal dictatorship is friends with the Americans, then they should be friends with the Americans too, and they couldn't possibly have any secular disputes whatsoever. It's completely delusional. And it's sad. It's sad. Just like when you see him with Trump derangement syndrome. Why is this so difficult? And, I think a big part is just the pathology of the state. We are brainwashed to have this different standard where we judge it by and so we give it a pass, and we think, so again, he looks at what the Saudi state does and just presumes then that that's the right thing and that everyone in that society should be thrilled, even though he must know. He knows that's not true in the United States, right? He knew that millions of Americans hated Donald Trump and hated every single thing that he did, reflexively. And sometimes with reason, he would surely admit. And he knows that's also true for Democrats. He knows that's true for Biden. He knows that's true for Obama. But he doesn't understand that for another country? Like, Saudi Arabia is encapsulated by whatever agreement the princeling says. No. No. Absolutely not. That's stupid. That's stupid. So, and that attitude is that blasé attitude. They should love us. They should love us. We subsidize their government. They hate their government. They hate their government with the rage that all Americans should hate our government. And if their religion makes them more willing to do something about it, then maybe it would be good to have their religion here. So, anyway. Happy anniversary.